We are so honored on day 4,926 of Boswell being in business to be hosting for the very first time Tom Perotta, the author of Tracy Flick Can't Win, as well as, and I don't know if I can get all this right, I think maybe 9 other novels or 8 other novels and 2 collections of short stories. The book has won raves and continues to. New York Times wrote, even more piercing than its predecessor, with a lyric polyphonic intensity, Perotta poses a question to the class: what if we learned? And Esquire has written, told with Perotta's piercing wit, wisdom, and exquisite insight into human folly, Tracy's second act delivers acerbic insight and frustrated ambition. Perotta is the author, oh, there it is, 10 works of fiction, 8 novels, 2 sections of collections of short stories, both of which, including Election and Little Children, both of which were made into critically acclaimed movies, and The Leftovers and Mrs. Fletcher, which were both adapted into HBO series. Thank you for letting me get that off my chest. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me, Daniel. That was great. And I told you, and I will tell anyone who happens to be viewing this, I am in my childhood bedroom in New Jersey, though it has been redone since I vacated it some decades ago. So I didn't choose the wallpaper behind me, but it conceals or replaced the bicentennial wallpaper that was there when I was a kid that had like Minutemen and cannons and that sort of thing.
Patriotic to the core. What can we say?
It was the bicentennial era.
Yeah. Well, I was going to ask you to read a little bit, but I do have to say, because you're compelling me to, were there any posters on that in that bedroom, and what were they of?
Okay, so I am not usually a big name dropper, but there's a point of pride for me. I had a Led Zeppelin poster. They was like, Robert Plant shirtless with, really like low-rise jeans. And then I had a picture of the Jay Giles band led by Peter Wolf. And I will say, just in the vicissitudes of my life, I happened to meet both Robert Plant and Peter Wolf. And I told Peter Wolf that I'd had a poster of him on my wall, and he was not happy to hear it because I was a kid. And I said, like, when I was like 13, and I think it made him feel old, weirdly.
You were like, oh, no. It wasn't about Centerfold. It was like, must have got lost.
It was much earlier. It was Full House, yeah. And but so when I was lucky enough to meet Robert Plant, I kept my mouth shut. I thought that was pretty good to have seen like 2 people who you saw every day as an adolescent on your wall to actually meet them,
And that is why you write novels, and that's why you adapt them to the screen.
There you
go. I don't know if I think this interview's over. That's the most amazing.
Yeah, I've never mentioned that before, but it's true.
So, but you did prepare a page to read. So would you be willing to read a page from Tracy?
Yeah, so and I'll introduce it by explaining, Tracy Flick Can't Win is a sequel to Election. And I think you could read it without having read Election or seen the movie. It does give some background to it, but I'll just give you a quick summary. Tracy Flick in Election is a high school student who is running for president and totally deserves to win. She is the hardest working candidate. She's worked her way up the ladder. Everybody knows that Tracy should be president, except the teacher who runs the student government has a grudge against her, and he tries to steal an election. And luckily for Tracy, his fraud is exposed, and she gets her rightful office as student council president. And, she has political ambitions even as a high school student, and she feels like she's on her way to something special. And this book, Tracy Flick Can't Win, picks up some 25 or so years later. Tracy is middle-aged, and she's not a congresswoman or a senator or a district attorney. She's a high school assistant principal, and she's just found out that the principal job is opening up to her. And so in a funny way, even though 25 years have passed, she's still back where she started at a high school in New Jersey, fighting to get this top job that she totally deserves and running into obstacles that, seem very unfair to her. And so this is a brief section. It's one of the few sections where Tracy reflects on her past, and the two books are sort of in conversation with one another. So she's just had she's just thinking about the job, the principal job, and having to interview, the indignity of having to interview for a job that she's actually held. She was once the acting principal while the main principal was gone. So this is her reflecting in the way I think a lot of middle-aged people do. It's hard, at a certain point in life to feel like you have to keep jumping through hoops when you feel like you've proven yourself over and over again. And so this is Tracy kind of thinking in those terms. Coming in second too many times is tough on anyone's self-esteem, but it was especially hard for me because it brought back memories I'd prefer not to dwell on. Back when I was in high school, I lost an election for president of the Student Government Association because a teacher, our civics instructor, if you can believe that, tampered with the votes. It sounds crazy, but it's true. This crooked teacher, a man I'd liked and respected and learned a lot from, wanted my male opponent to win so badly, he tossed 2 ballots in the trash, turning me from a winner into a loser. That's how close it was. I won by a single vote, which was humiliating in and of itself because I was so overqualified for the job, it was ridiculous. I've been preparing to run for president ever since middle school, and probably even before that. I'd climbed my way methodically up the ladder of student government, homeroom representative as a freshman, secretary the following year, highly unusual for a sophomore, and then treasurer as a junior, putting in the time, doing the work, earning the trust of my fellow students. Or at least I thought so, until half of them stabbed me in the back by voting for my completely unqualified but super popular rival. For a while, in my 20s, I tried to turn it into a funny story, but no one ever laughed. I think it just made people wonder if there was something wrong with me. And I couldn't help wondering that myself, because why else would a teacher hate me so much that he'd ruin his life just to stop me from getting something I desperately wanted and totally deserved? In the end, the fraud was exposed. The teacher resigned and I became president, but my victory never felt as good or as clean as it should have. The whole experience left a bad taste in my mouth that still hasn't gone away, and I doubt it ever will.
I want to say that I've read, this is it's like I was joking that it's your 999th interview. And of course, you remember all the ones you've done. I've watched a lot of the ones you've done. In fact, I booked this event. I'm like, oh, there's an NPR interview coming on again. but there's still things that I think many questions I will ask have been asked before. Some maybe haven't been. One of the things that is interesting to me to revisit, there's been a lot of authors revisiting characters. And one of the things you said that was very interesting to me was that you didn't know you were writing about Tracy Flick when you wrote this book. And I think that's a really interesting story. So would you just talk a little about that writing process?
Yeah, so, the genesis of books is very mysterious to me even now, because I think mostly my theory is, and I probably borrowed it from somebody who said it in an interview when I was younger and really looking for strategies for, writing, because it's hard and it's mysterious. But somebody said, what you really need is just the fuel to get started. Once you get started, then you have to keep kind of gathering you kind of create your own fuel. Sometimes I say, oh, it's like a machine that builds itself or something like that. Like you just have to get moving. And in this case, what got me moving was the idea of, I wanted to tell a story about a guy who was like a, mediocre professional football player, but like a high school golden boy star. And he plays like 3 seasons in the NFL, and like many players, has to leave because of an injury, and has to go from this glamorous, high-paying job. This is the pinnacle of his field, to an ordinary life, and it's a really hard fall for him. And he becomes an alcoholic. He has all kinds of messy marriages. And when we meet him in this book, he's in his 40s and he's in recovery. And, the only good thing that happens is he's invited back to his hometown to be honored by this new hall of fame that is being started up. And so I just thought, it was a way of grappling with, a subject that I've returned to over and over again in my work, which is, toxic masculinity, or just, alpha males and the destruction that they sometimes leave in their wake. And I just had this idea that it was almost like a Christmas Carol kind of thing, like somebody goes back into their past expecting to be honored, and instead has to confront, the damage that they caused when they were younger. So that was where I started. And when I started to tell that story, I was really focused also on like the idea of, how does this guy get picked? Like what is it that makes somebody like that, who's obviously deeply flawed, still the obvious person to be honored? Like, it says something about our values. And I started writing about the people in the town, in the school board, the people who start the Hall of Fame. And I started to write it in the style that mimicked Election, which is written in short chapters, narrated by multiple characters. It's sort of a collective picture of a school, and I felt a little anxious about doing that, because it felt like I was, going back to the well. Like, why am I should come up with a new form for this new story. Why am I telling it like it's Election? And yet I couldn't write it any other way. And I often think, as writers, we're leaving subconscious hints to ourselves, because we just can't know everything all at once. And at just a certain point, I thought, wait a second, is Tracy Flick here? Am I hearing Tracy? Does Tracy have her hand up? The way Tracy always has her hand up, saying, pick me, put me in. And once I did that, once I did that, the book suddenly made perfect sense to me.
Yeah.
And it became a book about Tracy. And I will say, she had been on my mind, not so much for the book that I was writing, but because Me Too had happened. And one variety of Me Too story that I was very interested in were these young women who had had affairs with teachers. And Tracy is one of those in Election, and she is, pretty defiant about it. She says, she basically tells a story that is about her own agency, which was, I wanted to do it, I did it, I realized it was not right for me, and I stopped. And now I'm going to go on with my life and continue my string of victories leading to the fulfillment of all my dreams. So she's just looking at it as like an experience that she had, and not as some terrible thing where a man took advantage of her. Now, there were a bunch of stories I read about women who had affairs with teachers, and maybe half of them would say, like, it was a terrible experience, and it really, kind of ruined my life or colored every relationship I had afterwards. And then there were other women who said, kind of echoed Tracy and just said, well, it happened. I went to college, we broke up. I I had a perfectly fine life. I'm married, happily married now. But there are others who said, like, for a long time, it didn't bother me, and now it does. And I think one of the reasons was because the cultural framing around those relationships had changed dramatically, and so I just wondered, I just, Me Too caused, I think, a lot of men to revisit their own personal experience, but it also caused me as a writer to go back and look at how I had written about the kind of relationship that had become the focus of Me Too. And I was curious if Tracy, and I sound like I'm Tracy is over here and she's a real person rather than someone who I'm, making choices for. But
of course she's real to you.
She is real to me. And I feel like, that is part of creating characters is to believe in them and to both feel connected to them, but feel that they have an autonomy that is a little bit outside of my own. And so this book really is Tracy, like a lot of women too, is looking back and saying, I had this experience. It felt a certain way to me then, but I now understand that it has affected my life in more complicated ways than I realized. But she still is, I was struck, in the writing, how hesitant I was and how hesitant Tracy was to accept the role of victim. Tracy is somebody who believes in her own agency and in her own power. She sees herself as strong and tough. And I think it was, she's just at the beginning of a process of examining what happened then. And I think, she created her own identity. She's one of those people who came from nowhere, but who had a very powerful idea of herself. And she doesn't want to surrender that idea of herself.
Yeah. When you write your 17th book about Tracy, she'll finally come to terms with it, probably.
Well, I never had written a sequel before. It's so funny that you mentioned Andrew Sean Greer. There've been so many writers, middle-aged writers revisiting characters in recent years, and I'm not Jennifer Egan, Elizabeth Strout over repeatedly, and obviously Updike had been doing it in the past. Philip Roth had done it in the past. It's not exactly new. Richard Ford did it with Frank Bascom. But I was struck by how many of my cohort of writers decided to do it during the pandemic. And I wonder if it was like partly just the strangeness of that moment that maybe pushed us toward the familiarity of something we had done before. I mean, I felt like I was actually responding, to the current moment in the book. So it didn't feel to me like I was, going back into my old bag of tricks as a kind of security blanket. And I had actually started the novel a little bit before the pandemic, but I am just wondering about the psychology of all these sequels.
Well, you've always been very interested in the dynamics of gender, and the theme comes up several times. I mean, there's a lot of imbalanced, uncomfortable relationships in this book. There's at least three. And so, you're definitely, kind of looking at that variations on a theme. And your books always, to me, speak to each other. I mean, you have so many interesting through lines, the way you can see both, your migration from a certain kind of man to your continuing interest in the educational system, as we should say.
That's right. That's absolutely right. And I do think there is something about schools as a place that puts, adults and in the case of high school, adolescents together. And it kind of, I think a lot of my teachers are, still involved in adolescent dramas of their own. In Tracy Flick Can't Win, the principal, Jack Weed, he's a man of retirement age. He's had a heart attack. He's on his way out, but he was in the 70s, at the height of the sexual revolution, was a kind of, a good looking young teacher. And Me Too has forced him to go back and talk about, his own guilty experiences back then. But he described it. He had been a scrawny guy, not very, popular with women. But then when he hit 30, he suddenly like came into himself, and he was lifting weights and getting into good shape. And suddenly these girls were flirting with him, and he was feeling his, kind of rock star self, and it led him into trouble. But it's, in a way, he is, I'm often, you have the Wishbones right over your shoulder there, that book about, rock musicians playing in a wedding band, and these guys who just don't want to give up their adolescence, and that I came of writerly age in the 90s, and when that era, the era of the slacker, the guy who just wouldn't grow up.
Love that movie.
That's kind of my time. And so I do think, that, we're asking some teachers to behave like adults, but in their hearts, they still feel like they're teenagers. And it's
don't
right?
you? I mean, I understand how old I'm a little older than you, but I mean, come on, I still feel, you turn around and you think you're still thinking thoughts like you were 17 or 22.
Yeah, you're thinking thoughts like you're 17 and 22, and unfortunately, when I do this, I have to look at myself in a little box. I'm like, who's the old guy in the box? What's he doing in my bedroom?
That's my childhood bedroom. I just, I have 20 years of questions to ask you, maybe more, because Wishbones was the first book I read of yours, and then I went back and read. Where's my copy of My Little Mass Market up there?
Isn't that great? I love that cover.
Chris and I are one of my who does a lot of events. He loves mass markets, and I was like, look, literary mass market. So, but
how did that even happen? Right, a mass market of a short story collection published by an indie press. It's
so crazy. Valentine used to do a lot of things, weird things like that. And actually, of all publishers, St. Martin's occasionally still does these weird little rack size books of literary books. So.
That is was Berkeley, and they bought paperback rights from Bridgeworks, which was a startup small press who made my.
I think they did Patty Jane's House of Curl too.
They certainly did. Yeah, they had a nice run. A woman named Alexandra Shelley was. One of the editors, Barbara Phillips and Warren Phillips, ran the company, but Alexandra Shelley was the editor, and we'd gone to college together, though I didn't know her in college, but I got to know her after college, and she was the one who she'd heard that Bad Haircut had won second prize, and like the AWP did that. It's like a nationwide short story collection contest, and I was the runner-up, and so she said, oh, I would love to see this book for my small press. And so she was the one who I think made it happen. So, and because the large presses are always banging down doors to get short story collections. Oh yeah, well, they were not banging down my door in those days. I wrote 3 books before I got one published, and that was so I wrote a novel that remains unpublished called Lucky Winners. Then I wrote Bad Haircut, and then I wrote Election. And for a long time, I couldn't get it. It was not 2 years, but it felt like a long time to have written 3, I think, pretty good books, and not being able to get them published. And then luckily this small press took on Bad Haircut. And then I wrote The Wishbones, and Berkeley's, partner company Putnam published that.
Right.
And then they also picked up Election because Election had been picked up for a movie before it was published.
Oh my God, it was so, I was the buyer for a store then. And I remember getting the thing and they're like, the hardcovers in April and the paperbacks in June and the movies in August. And it did make, once again, another question for you. I didn't even get to ask my Wishbones question, but my question for you is, so I had always thought to myself, and of course, I could have written to you and which would have forwarded to the publisher, and then 2 years later would have gotten back to me pre-internet to say, was this a screenplay first? Like, because it is such a short, digested book, and it works so well as a treatment. I had just always thought that you sold the film, and then they're like, you should have a book with this, or like, but no, that was a book first.
Yeah, it was a book first, and
unpublished.
What happened? Well, it was unpublished because the publishing industry was in a very weird place back then. It didn't know what young adult was anymore.
Right.
And so I think people looked at Election and they're like, this feels like it's young adult because it's about, kind of a microscopic look at these high school kids fighting for, this idiotic office, president of the student council. But it's also a political allegory, and it's a lot about illicit sexual relationships. And so that was not going to fly. Now it would fly as young adult and might well have been published as young adult.
It would have been very heavily edited though, because too many perspectives from adults.
Yeah. So that made, because it was a kind of global portrait of a high school, I think it didn't fit in either format, and so it kind of fell between the cracks as a book. But then I went to the Breadloaf Writers Conference and I read from the Wishbones, and a screenwriter named Janice Shapiro was there, and she thought the Wishbones would make a cool movie.
It did. It's called The Wedding Singer.
I know. It's a whole other story. But
I knew there was a story there.
Well, I don't know. There's a story. It just stole my thunder, But when she got me in touch with Albert Berger and Ron Yerkes, these producer friends of hers, and they wanted to know about the Wishbones, and I said, I'm not actually done with that book. I'll show it to you when I'm done. But I have this other book in my drawer that I can't get published. But I think it's, I think it could be a good movie, and weirdly, so there's this book. It doesn't fit into the publishing world at this moment, but Hollywood is making dark teen movies. Right. 1999 was the year of the dark teen movie, and Election, was one of the darkest, I think. And it got made really quickly, which is why there was that crazy confluence of, oh, here comes the hardcover, here comes the movie. Weirdly, the movie was held up because of the ending. The ending got rewritten because it didn't test well. So the movie doesn't have the same ending as the book. And if not for that 6-month delay, there never would have been a hardcover. There just would have been a movie tie-in of Election, because the movie would have beaten the book to the marketplace.
What was I'm trying to remember. There's another. Oh, Sideways. I think that's what happened with Sideways.
And that same director, Alexander Payne.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And I think Alexander.
That's what he likes.
I think he likes the idea. It's one thing to adapt a really well-known book. I think there's a responsibility to all those readers, But if you adapt an unknown book, I think there's just kind of more freedom.
Like what was the one he did? The one in Omaha, the insurance person, where he just kept the title. Right, about Schmidt. About Schmidt, yeah.
And that was actually a much more prominent book than Election or
right.
Yeah.
The Wishbones for me was like golden age of music, because it was that and High Fidelity came out within a couple of years of each other, and I was like, oh, this is and of course, then I wasn't interested in music anymore. So, but I still love music novels. Do you? So the question I do have about Election is, who owns? Can somebody do a movie of this, or does the film? Do they own the rights on the character?
So Paramount owns the rights to the character. So a movie can only be made through Paramount.
Right. That happened to us with when I was working in publishing. We published Psycho 2 by the original author. I was living in New York, but it turned out he was from Milwaukee, and so the movie turned out he was allowed to write a sequel, but they did a completely different movie from what he wrote. And we just did an event with Ann Cleves, and same thing. They own Vera, so not only the first book matches the television. Nothing else does. And
Well,
I don't think a lot of people understand that.
yeah, there are definitely some discussions going on about Tracy Flick Can't Win. And I think the real, uh, exciting scenario is that we can do it with the same. I mean, Alexander's still making movies. Reese
Right.
Witherspoon is still making movies. The same producers are still around. So, if we can make that happen, which I think there's a chance, it would be a pretty amazing thing to watch Reese Witherspoon play a character,
Yeah.
you know, as a teenager and then play her again as a middle-aged person. To have the same actor do that would be kind of amazing. I'm not sure I can think of another. I mean, I guess there are some reboots of shows where that happens, but I think,
right. Yeah, there's a reboots, and there's even a show called Reboot.
Right. Yes, and the thing about reboots, like when Tom Cruise does, the new Top Gun, the idea is he's still that guy, whereas I think with Tracy Flick in Election and Tracy Flick Can't Win, it's just as interesting to see, what she has lost and how she's changed and what it means to be, a middle-aged Tracy Flick who has been repeatedly frustrated. I think that would be a really interesting challenge, because I think that there's still that buoyancy and that drive in there too. So it's a complicated emotional palette, I think.
I have to say, and I'm not saying what the world says, but I remember my Election reading experience is that I was not necessarily I was very conflicted about Tracy as a heroine. There's nothing, she's absolutely the moral heart and heroine and hero and everything, she's the person I care about the most in this book. And I felt like, so I don't know if that's more, did I read Election wrong then, or have you changed as you've gotten older?
Yeah, no, and I think I was thinking about this because when you write a sequel, you're doing something deliberate, and you're in a conversation with the previous thing. So I wrote Election in a kind of in pure innocence, right? I mean, I was just telling this one story. I wasn't thinking of all these characters, Tracy is the one who is going to endure in the culture. Tracy is one of an ensemble in Election. And it's really a Mr. M story more than anybody's. Tracy's maybe in second, but could be Tammy. I really love the character of Tammy. So I think, what happened was Reese Witherspoon turned in this electrifying performance as Tracy. And as you say, a lot of people saw her as a kind of a villain, that she was an abrasive young woman who was really annoying. And it was like really a reflection of the sexism of that time,
right,
and of the people's unfamiliarity with, or just discomfort with really powerful and ambitious young women who were suddenly everywhere. Because, women weren't even most colleges didn't admit women till the late 60s. So it was when I was in college in the late 70s, this was the first wave of women who were, competing with men in college, entering professions in big numbers, and beginning to enter politics. There just weren't a lot of, stories about women in very public roles. And I think Reese Witherspoon turned in this performance and really caught something in the zeitgeist, this, I think, sexist discomfort with an ambitious young woman. And so for a while, that character was treated as almost like a cautionary tale, don't be a Tracy Flick, and she sometimes would appear on these internet lists of great movie villains. And you're wait a second, she's the villain? She's a high school girl who's trying to get elected president, and this teacher crookedly tries to fix an election against her, and she's the villain. And she does a few underhanded campaign tactics, and she has, as we mentioned, an affair with the teacher. But there, is that her fault exactly?
No, it's power dynamic.
Yeah. And so what happened was then, at a certain point in the last 10 years, critics started to revisit that character and say, wait a second, why is Tracy Flick the villain? And looking at her through a kind of proto Me Too lens, it was suddenly like, she's a girl who's victimized by two male teachers took advantage of her, and then the culture kind of piled on and said something was wrong with her. And it was a fascinating experience for me as a writer to just watch a character kind of get separated from my book, first by a movie, then by a kind of
meme almost.
Yeah, to turn into a meme and to become a subject of an ongoing dialogue. And as the culture changed and rethought certain issues, that character got reinterpreted. And it was really, some part of me wanted to re-enter that conversation. And that, I think, was where this book came from. And so, yes, but, Tracy is at the center of it because, I was involved in that conversation, which didn't exist when I wrote Election, right? I mean, yeah. Tracy just was one of, a half dozen characters in that book.
One of the things that I really love about your book, well, I love that you confront all kinds of interesting arguments about gender, about sex and sexuality, about religion. I just, your religion books are so interesting to me. And I will say, like, as I have already vowed, I started reading your books very early, but it was really Little Children was the book that I just like exploded in my head. I mean, it's just like, I didn't used to rank my books, but that might have been my favorite book of the year it came out. And it was so uncomfortable. We've been watching old Curb Your Enthusiasms, and I like to call it like cringe comedy. And I was like, oh, nobody does cringe like Tom Perotta. This book is not as cringy. I feel like you have a more, you're like, you wanted to go somewhere else. Mrs. Fletcher, pretty cringy. So, so I'm just saying, don't leave cringe altogether.
I know. Well, I think.
But it's a line. Like, it's really tough to like, what if you wind up, it turns out in a couple of years you're on the wrong side of the line, Well,
I'd like to be near the line, I think I do feel sometimes that there was a kind of sense in the 90s and a little bit later that part of the artist's job was to kind of provoke discomfort, and to examine, to turn the lens back on both ways, like on the reader. Right. And I think now the country's become so polarized and we have such tribal identities. I think a lot of people,
I think it's harder.
Don't like to push at the boundaries of, what the tribe, what the consensus within the tribe is, and I get it. I feel it politically, I wrote a book called The Abstinence Teacher, which you're talking about my religious books, and it's about a woman teaching sex education, and she comes under fire from evangelical Christians in her town who, don't want her teaching comprehensive sex ed or, talking to kids about pleasure or about, queer sex or, any subjects that fall outside of their very strict endorsement of abstinence. And, in the book, it's like she becomes friendly, might be too strong a word, but she gets
no, they are friends, I think.
Yeah, eventually becomes friends with her daughter's soccer coach, who is a member of this church. And this was written in, like, I think it was 2007, maybe, The Abstinence Teacher.
I'll give you a number.
There it is. I think 2007, right? So it's written in, like,
you had a lot of reviews. So.
Um, and I think that I wrote it,
Yeah, 2007.
yeah, with that, what now seems like a misguided liberal faith that we were all still one community, and what we owed each other was dialogue, and that dialogue would expose commonality. I think it also is in that realm of like a separate piece, like they connect. The fight still goes on outside in the world, but they themselves have seen it, a commonality that draws them together. I don't have that faith post-Trump, you know. I don't imagine like you could a character like Ruth could connect with like a QAnon person or a white nationalist and say, oh, we're all part of the same community, and we ultimately, just want to raise our kids right and have a place where, we can have happy lives and live together with our neighbors, even if we don't agree with them all the time. I just like we're in a state now where like I don't know how that divide that Ruth and Tim had to speak across, they could hear each other. Now that the chasm is so big, we can't hear each other. And whenever some sound comes over from there, it's like, whoa, that's terrifying.
On the other hand, there's probably people who voted for Trump that and like you don't know, they may not have told you, because that's part of that sort of like the great sort, and also just that people, like if they want to have common ground, if they want to connect with you at all, they don't, people either want to not connect with you and then they're going to tell you everything, or they're going to not talk about
it. I agree. I think though, like in 2005 and 6, when I was writing The Abstinence Teacher, even like Fox News wasn't as quite as
it's a different world.
Social media didn't exist, and so I think people were just like not quite siloed off in different realities in the same way, or so it seemed to me.
There were a lot more, they talk about the, in terms of the sort, about, how separated out counties are, blue counties, red counties. And there were just a lot more purple ones. So you can just file that as one of your speculative novels then. Along with The Leftovers. I was just going to ask you, one of my questions I was interested in, you do, like any book you write will feel like a Tom Perotta book to me. But I'm curious, is like, how far afield are you willing to go? Would you write a horror novel? Would you write a genre mystery novel? Would you adapt? I always want to know, like Shakespeare or Jane Austen. Everybody gets to write one. You can't write, once you start writing a bunch of them, then you're doing something. But you get to write like one adaptation of a classic. I think there is a Dickens of Barbara Kingsolver coming next week. So version of one of the only two Dickens books I have ever read. So
I'll answer the early question there, which was, to me, The Leftovers is kind of right now that's how far I have been able to go. Yeah. That was I think I was reacting to this very exciting moment, when literary writers have been writing post-apocalyptic stuff for a long time. But I just felt like suddenly that field was open in an interesting way. And I was watching, Walking Dead and with my son, and I was really struck by we both loved it. He was just a young guy at that time. He's 28 now, so he was probably like 12, 13 when we were watching it. And I just thought like, oh, it was almost like I could do something that was, I wanted to write like the least apocalyptic post-apocalyptic novel, and my idea was, if you looked out the window, it wasn't like zombies were like lurching across the street, and it wasn't like the cars couldn't drive anymore, or you know, there were icicles hanging from, you know, whatever it was. It was like, it's the same world, but there's been a psychological disturbance, you know, and so it all kind of feels different. And that was the challenge there, to write like a post-apocalyptic novel where the threat and the collapse is internal in some way. And so that was like a really fun thing, because I really did believe that I was operating inside, you know, genre conventions. What was fascinating then was when the show got made, and I ended up, you know, collaborating with Damon Lindelof, who just is a fabulous storyteller, who is much more embedded, like at the heart of those sort of genre conventions, you know, and he kind of put back in a lot of the
things you took out
that I had left out. And at first I resisted it, but then he did it so cleverly, and the show became, you know, really exciting to me, just because it allowed me to see my story in a whole new way. So that was different from like a faithful adaptation where you feel like I watched the movie of Little Children or something, and I feel like, oh yeah, that's like my novel come to life, you know. Whereas The Leftovers, like, wow, this is like a funhouse mirror version of this book that I wrote.
You know, you've done several of, you know, Mrs. Fletcher you worked on that too.
Yeah.
But you come back to fiction, and I think about some of my favorite novelists like David Benioff, and more recently Patrick Somerville, who wrote books, you know, among my favorite.
Wrote on The Leftovers with us.
That is true. That is true. And I love Cradle is one of my favorite books, and City of Thieves. And I think, oh, you're never coming back, are you? But you come back.
I think the difference is that I only adapt my own stuff. I'm not really like a screenwriting crafts person, you know. It's like I like to, you know, I like this idea of seeing my stories up on a screen, and I like to be part of that process. I love film, and I love being around filmmakers, and I love being around actors, and I've been so lucky to see, you know, what the amazing things actors have done, you know, not just Reese Witherspoon, but, you know, Kate Winslet in Little Children, Patrick Wilson in Little Children, Catherine Hahn in Mrs. Fletcher, the whole bunch of, I mean, amazing actors who were in The Leftovers, Carrie Coon, Justin Theroux, and Regina King. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people, and Margaret Qualley. And so that's just been a real thrill. But I also, you know, it's not just some like diversion to me. I mean, I feel like for whatever reason, and this goes all the way back to Election, which was a book that nobody paid attention to, but the movie people paid attention to. I feel like to the extent my works have been part of a cultural conversation, it's often been because of the movie versions.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've been able to have a long career as a writer because I think the visibility of the adaptations has made people know my work. And that's hard to do. As you know, you're a bookseller. It's like, it's really hard to get people to remember a writer and to have like a kind of long-term relationship with their books.
Well, I have a couple of things before we go. One of them is you need to get your agent to get your books, because I know there are 3 different publishers, but I know this can happen. Like I want all the books available. I don't want any print on demand, any books anymore. And I want cohesive covers. I want them to look like Toni Morrison's books or like Colson Whitehead's books. I know those are both, or Barbara Kingsolver's books, or just like they did it with, who did that? What was the agent for Elmer Leonard, where they different publishers got. Actually, you did it with Election. That the new Election cover matches perfectly. Tracy Flick Can't Win.
Yeah.
I want the rest of them. Thank you very much.
No, I know it's hard. It's like it's unlikely to go into a bookstore and find the Wishbones on
exactly. Or actually, it's, you know, the Macmillan stuff's mostly POD, and it's sometimes pretty high priced, and All paperbacks are getting pretty high price, so that maybe they're catching up. But it would be nice. It'd be nice for people nice for the books to be reissued. They stand up. You won't find little children, and you probably won't even find the leftovers. It's ridiculous, and they should all be there, and they should all look beautiful and contemporary. All right, that's that. Thank you for letting me say that. I told you 20 years of questions here. Greg Wendling would like to ask one too. Fine. Tracy Flick is real to me, as are all your characters, which is one of the many reasons why you make my short list of favorite authors. As a male author, and this is one of my, I so second this. How do you write such authentic female voices? And do you have a different approach to writing female characters than male characters?
Well, I'm certainly more careful, right? I think, on the one hand, I feel like, there is a certain audacity, involved anytime you cross identity lines, and, some identity lines are stronger than others, but I do know that there are certain subjects that like I'm not necessarily touching, like Tracy Flick doesn't talk about her period or something like that, when I write it, and that's like just a superficial thing, but I think like I have to be we're just very careful about details, and but that said, when I started out, when I wrote The Wishbones and Bad Haircut, I was like often associated with Nick Hornby and considered to be a guy who wrote really well about, young men and male friendship and male subcultures. And when I wrote Election, I knew I had to write some women characters, and Tracy and Tammy were really my first crack at women characters rendered from the inside. And the fact that Tracy then became a kind of a cultural watchword, and I would run into women for years who would just say to me, "Oh, I was Tracy Flick," and they would just say to me, and they weren't saying I was some, annoying young woman. They're like, I was ambitious, and I had my hand in the air, and I was the president of everything, and I tried so hard to prove myself, and they would say that with a kind of affection, and I feel like, okay, I did that. I did something that meant something to women, and they saw it as like it felt authentic to them, and I think it gave me some confidence to just keep going in that sense. And I did find, for whatever reason, that when I wrote like Sarah in Little Children or Eve Fletcher, those characters felt like I heard their voices very strongly, like they just were there for me. I don't know, I can't say where that comes from, but I think I have this, I feel like I can do it, and that helps me to do it. But a lot of it goes back to, I was really nervous about the reception of Election, and instead of getting pushback in a sense of like you overreached there and you missed this or that, I got like real affirmation that felt real to me.
That's so cool. Hey, when I watched the 700 other videos, I seem to remember your next project was also, and I never call these, I don't feel like this is a sequel to Election. I feel like it's a companion novel.
Yeah, that's a good.
It's completely not, it completely reads on its own. And if you could have written this book and just said, I'm not going to call her Tracy Flick, I'm going to call it something else, and the book would have worked perfectly. But I heard you're working on another project that might draw up something else. Did I get that right?
Not so much, but it's something that just started, but it kind of revisits the world of Bad Haircut, only not through any characters who reappear, but just that world of the 70s that I was writing about, what it felt like to grow up in like a working class town in New Jersey in the 1970s. You know, when I wrote it in the late 80s and early 90s, it was just my life, you know.
Yeah.
There was no real perspective that I had on it. Now I'm writing a book that's about somebody like my age now, kind of remembering coming of age in that time, and it's a very different tone, you know. And I would say that to the extent that Tracy Flick, as you said, was less cringy and maybe more melancholy, I think that there is something in me right now that is sort of, you know, looking back without that kind of, you know, comic sensibility, with a much more, you know, an attempt to just reckon with, like, how do we get from there to here? And, you know, how much just gets lost in the flow of time, you know, that's just part of being the old guy in the box, you know?
Yeah. I can't remember most things that happened in the 70s, and I really did not think I would say that someday.
Well, that's been part of it too. You know, there's a way of writing history where you do all kinds of research, and there's another way, which is just to say, like, you know, why do we remember what we remember, and why are we, you know, we forget so much. Like, you know, you think about high school, it's this whole world that you're in, and it's just this gigantic cast of characters, and then you just remember it in like a paragraph, like, oh, I was a football player, but then I quit and I tried to play the guitar, and, you know, got it. You know, just you tell like a little story that is
Right.
that whole world just gets reduced. You know, the same way like a whole relationship, you could go out with somebody for years and be madly in love with them, but then you break up, and 20 years later, you're just like, oh, you know, we used to go to the beach a lot, you know.
It was a good beach too. Not so many
I
plastic
got
bags
sunburned
on it.
really bad.
Well, before we go, I'm sure everybody at this point has a copy of, they better have a copy of Tracy Flick Can't Win. But if they don't, if for some odd reason you're the last person who would be wanting to watch an hour with Daniel talking to Tom Perotta, this is the way you can buy a copy. We do have a few of the pads, buttons, pens, complete election kit.
Crazy swag.
Yeah, the swag. We can't send it book rate. That's the only problem. You have to pick it up or go priority mail. But otherwise, the world is your oyster. Make a list of reasons why you should run for something. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Daniel.
And in 22 more years, I'll have more questions for you.
Yes, Tracy will be trying to become the social director of the senior home.
That's right. Let me just say, I never won any election or anything in my life. Always lost.
I was home representative for 4 years.
Oh, you braggart.
But I didn't go for the big offices.
Yeah, well, it's tough. It's intimidating too. Thanks for everyone for joining us. We wouldn't have a bookstore without you. Can't wait for your next book.
Thanks so much, Daniel. Great talking to you.